Now for a unit that you all have probably been waiting for, we are going to talk extensively about World War II this week. Again, this is not an exhaustive unit. You could take entire courses on World War II and not go over everything that you could possibly know about it. Lots of films, lots of books. I will make some recommendations of my own at the very end of the unit, get back into that I kind of missed out on here on Canvas. But anyway, deal with this unit is we focus on most of the causes and the effects. We do talk about some of the battles, but the causes and effects a little more important in terms of what you need to know as far as what is relevant to your daily life than per se what tactics were used at the Battle of the Bulge to win that. We will talk about Battle of the Bulge and all those major battles, but anyway, just want to make sure that you all understand here's what's relevant to your life and here's how this has influenced the world. Especially this is currently 2022, and we are experiencing a major war over in Europe between Russia and Ukraine. Some very broad similarities between those two, that conflict and World War II. So without further ado, let's go ahead and go through a few sections on this. Now, in terms of what I'm going over, while this is an American history class, you need to know what caused the war in the first place. Over in Europe, the Americans tried to stay largely out of it, but I want to make sure that you all are fully aware. Here's why World War II takes place, and then how the Americans get roped into it. So, kicking things off over in Europe. Over in Europe, excuse me, there is a series of events that happens that ultimately leads to the rise of Hitler in Germany and makes Hitler very popular among the German people. Now, among these things, Hitler was already rising to power in Germany based off of his basically dissection of the League of Nations and criticism for the League of Nations, as well as the hefty fines that the German people were having to pay for this, or pay for World War I, I should say. So, 1933, the world is in full swing of the Great Depression. It is not just an American problem, it is a worldwide problem. And London is home to a conference or a international meeting of leaders that they attempt to show how they could possibly fix the Great Depression, increase trade among nations, work together basically to make sure that all these things are fixed and there's no issues moving forward with the economy, which of course the Great Depression for some parts of the world lasted another 8 to 9 years after this. Now, this conference, while it was well intended, it accomplished basically nothing. It did show the U.S. Decided that we wanted to be isolated and take care of our problems at home. This is right as FDR is sworn into office over in the United States. But basically, Europe gets together and says, here's some solutions we have to solve the Great Depression. And they all walked away saying, well, that sounds good, but that doesn't really work for my country. So, speaking of which, with isolationism in the United States, we start breaking down some of our barriers that had not allowed us to be isolated before. One such barrier is this good neighbor policy with Latin America, as you can remember from units of the past with the age of imperialism. We decided that we would intervene militarily in Latin America if something threatened our economic interests down there. But anyway, we declare in the, I believe 1930s, may have been as late as 1940, but we declare that we will no longer use Latin America. We will no longer use the military in that region to solve any disputes or economic issues that we may have down there. And this gets put to the test because shortly thereafter, after this policy is issued by FDR, Mexico is going to seize oil property, or United States oil property in Mexico, and try to take this over for their own personal use. Now, a lot of the oil companies wanted us to go in with the military. We negotiated instead of sending in the military, and we were able to get our property back and avoid armed intervention. Okay, but this did put that new policy to the test. Okay, other things that are going to be happening throughout the world prior to World War II, they're going to start making nations more interconnected, with the exception of the United States. Italy, home to Rome, along with Berlin, which is in Germany. Those two countries are going to form an alliance in 1936, shortly before Hitler hosts the 1936 Olympics. Okay, now this alliance is going to form between the fascist leaders of Hitler of Germany and Benito Mussolini of Italy, who I'll talk about more here in just a few minutes. But those two decide that they wanted to form a fascist alliance to block out communism and make essentially militaristic empires able to rise in Europe again. Okay, now those two formed this axis in 1936. It expands in 1940 as Japan is going to join that, officially forming the Axis powers, this new alliance, militaristic imperialist nations. Now, because of these alliances, which people had agreed to not reforming after World War I, and because of Germany no longer making the war reparations and deciding that they were going to basically go their own way in terms of how they were going to approach the World War I peace treaty, this is going to end the League of Nations. Basically, the League of Nations ceases to exist, especially after Hitler begins taking land in other countries. But because the League of Nations failed to stand up to Germany or Italy with their fascist aggressions or their imperialistic aggressions, League of Nations loses all, essentially loses all respect and basically ceases to exist. Okay, it was considered to be a nice idea, but it just did not work. Okay, this is why it is brought back under a new name with different membership requirements after World War II as the United Nations. Okay, now elsewhere in the world, over in the Pacific, there is a lot of tension with Japan, who is trying to rapidly expand their empire. Japan actually did fight in World War I. They negotiated part of the peace treaty and were able to obtain some land there. Okay, however, in 1937, Japan is going to take their militarism to the next level, and they are going to invade China. And FDR is upset by this, and he says, you know, in the Pacific Ocean, we allow this to be free of all conflict and open to all trade. If Japan is going to continue taking territories, then we need to join in and have our not allies, but the people we get along with the best, and say that we are going to quarantine aggressors in Italy, Germany, and Japan. And what this basically means is we're not going to buy things from them, we're not going to sell to them, and we are not going to accept very many things they do without some sort of debate or consequence. Okay, now Germany, Italy, and Japan, the Axis powers are targeted by this. It's technically a break with isolationism, and it basically shows that while the United States says we're isolated, we truly are not, because we're still meddling in international affairs with this type of policy. Okay, and this quarantine speech, again, is going to be something that is going to wind up getting the United States in World War II. Now, Japan also, around this point in time, they sank a boat called the Panay. Some parallels there between World War I and World War II. This boat sinks, it killed 2, wounded 30. It was an accident. The Japanese U-boat did not mean to shoot this passenger ship. However, some of the United States are going to begin demanding war, but the situation did cool. However, over in China, where several American businessmen were, Americans are going to wind up being arrested and detained and beaten by Japan, who is resenting us for the amount of restrictions we are placing on them and their trade, as well as economic sanctions that we are putting on them. Okay, now, a few terms that I've mentioned before that you may not have any clue as to what they were. We have totalitarianism and fascism. Okay, these are both things that Hitler and Mussolini did, as well as Tojo over in Japan, and I'll talk more about him in a few minutes as well. Totalitarianism, if you see the first 5 letters of this, total, that basically means that the government has total control over all citizens. They can control where they live, what they read, where they work, so on and so forth. It is also utilized by Stalin and the Soviet Union. Basically, if somebody disagrees with you, you purge them. They eliminated all political enemies. Anybody that was a threat to power could be imprisoned or killed. In the Soviet Union, with Stalin, throughout intentional famines, as well as purges, I believe Stalin wound up killing about 40 million people during this era. Hitler, a little less clear. I do know at one point in time 30,000 political enemies were rounded up. I cannot remember off the top of my head what happened to them. Same thing in Italy. If you oppose the government, you could go to jail or a political prison camp, or you could just outright be executed. Okay, so totalitarianism can lead to fascism. Fascism stresses nationalism, so there's an extreme pride in your country where you're willing to use violence against others who are not of your country. and it does use totalitarianism in which they take control over all citizens. Some people like this quite a bit, especially those that are used to having a monarch in charge of them. But anyway, with this in Germany and Italy, they make people fear the communists, which is a stark contrast to the Soviet Union, which embraces communism. But fascism on the political scale, if you're looking at communism to fascism, in terms of its liberalness and conservativeness, on the left-hand side, as far as liberal, communism falls all the way over there. Fascism is a complete rejection of this, all the way over on the right-hand side of conservatism. Basically, a lot of people wanting to build up that military and get things back to the way they had been for these countries. Okay, now the most popular form, and I shouldn't say popular, most infamous form of fascism is going to be Nazism. This is German fascism. Nazism was started by Hitler. His desire again was to unite Germany into a great empire as it once was. He also wanted racial purification of blonde-haired, blue-eyed, Aryan people of the Aryan race, which basically is just white, blonde-haired, blue-eyed. He wanted to form a master race of superior humans based off of this, which is ironic because Hitler is neither blonde-haired nor blue-eyed, nor is he actually German. He's from Austria. Okay, now several of these ideas are presented in a highly banned book in some communities called Mein Kampf. I've never actually read through this, but I have seen excerpts of it. Mein Kampf means my struggle in German, and it talks about Hitler's time in prison whenever he was arrested for speaking out against the Weimar Republic government, which took over for Germany. And he also within there talks about his distaste for Jewish folks, and he developed this distaste for Jewish folks after reading a pamphlet which suggested that all world issues had been caused by Jewish folks. So something to keep in mind as we move forward here. And by the way, towards the end of the year, I may throw in some stuff about Holocaust and genocides of the 20th century. That is more of a European history thing rather than American history. I apologize. I know it's something that several of you want to go over. But in terms of what you need to know for this class, it's not really relevant per se. We will talk about how the Americans uncovered the camps and the effects that it had on people. But anyway, it's not a focused section like we'd normally have in notes. Okay. Now, the other ism you have to keep in mind is isolationism. This is what the United States tries to practice, so that way we are not meddling in world affairs. We wanted to remain isolated and to keep to ourselves, which is going to hurt our trade through a series of tariffs and things like that. But we also believe that we needed to remain neutral and not pick sides in this. And one of the questions I have for you this week was the United States isolated and neutral, or were we not at all? Okay. So it actually was technically illegal for us to not be neutral thanks to something called the Neutrality Acts. This is a series of laws that banned us from selling weapons to countries that are at war or engaged in a civil war. We also could not give cash to them. The way we got around this is we started trading weapons to them, specifically the British. We began trading weapons to them before they went to war. And we did this through something called the Lend-Lease Act. And we rented the weapons to them technically, as well as giving them loans. But anyway, like I said, we found a way around this. Nations that had not officially declared war on each other, we'd still trade with. And throughout the whole process of Lend-Lease, we sent about $50 billion in weapons to Europe, pretty significant amount. But anyway, eventually you're going to have more manpower, and that's whenever the Americans get involved. But again, we wanted to try to keep conflicts over there in Europe. We did not want them to spill over here to the United States. Now, over in Europe, the war officially gets underway. Pretty similar stuff that happened over here in Ukraine, along with Vladimir Putin here in the last few weeks. Basically, it was well known that Hitler was going to start taking land, and the rest of the world was asked, what can you do to stop this? Well, some people actually wanted Hitler to take this land that I'm getting ready to talk about. Other people did not. Over in Russia right now, we knew well in advance that Vladimir Putin might go in and try to take Ukraine from the Ukrainians. And due to alliances, some people have said they would fight. Other people said they would not. But largely people have backed off and just kind of let Putin come in and take what he wants as of right now. The Ukrainians are putting up a big fight as of the time I'm reading this. But anyway, the deal on that is there's this question. How much more will he take, or will he stop? Well, parallels back to World War II with Hitler. There was a question of if he was going to keep taking things or if he was going to stop. And he had essentially promised he was going to stop, and I'll talk about that here in a second. But anyway, what winds up happening? Hitler is going to go into Austria, I believe that is his homeland, and he is going to take that essentially unopposed. But he had planned on fighting a war if he needed to in order to take that. Once he does take it, everybody knew that, and he did this to reunite people that spoke German and reunite the once mighty Empire of Germany. Well, now he has his sights set on the land of Czechoslovakia, which is immense farmland, and he is going to try to take this so that way he can feed his empire. Well, the British and the French, who said, we're done taking new territories in Europe after World War I, and without the help of the League of Nations, they said, we will help the Czechs as long as we possibly can, even if this means we have to fight a war against Hitler. Well, Hitler comes out and he promises that if they allow him to take Czechoslovakia, so that way he can have farmland to feed his people and his empire, he will not take any further land. Well, the leaders of Britain and France get together with Hitler and they say, how do we have your word that you will not do this? And literally a slip of paper is taken out. Hitler signs the piece of paper without any writing on it other than his name, excuse me, and says, you have my word. Hands it off to the British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain. Neville Chamberlain returns home and delivers a speech that says he has the piece of their times in his hand. In other words, he has the ultimate peace treaty in his hand, which is just a signature of Hitler. And this was mocked as and I'm not going to say this online, but it was mocked as a POS. So anyway, because everybody knew that Hitler probably would start taking more land. Winston Churchill, in particular, a guy that you're going to get to know this unit, pretty cool voice if you ever listen to his speeches, but he is going to declare this as an act of appeasement. An appeasement is where you give up something that you want or want to keep protected in order to pacify an aggressor. In other words, Churchill felt that Hitler had taken these lands and the British and the French had allowed him to do it because they were afraid of him and they thought this would shut him up. And turns out Churchill was right. He was going to continue taking lands further and further as much as he could throughout the rest of the decade and then into World War II. So we'll talk more about that here in a second. Now, matter of fact, we're going to talk about it right now. Hitler had come to call his empire the Third Reich of Germany, or the Third Rising of Germany, and his focus then becomes upon Poland. Poland is a country, still exists, that lies between Germany as well as Russia. Well, Hitler knew that Stalin also wanted to have a piece of Poland for himself because of the resources they have there and the people that they have there, having some cultural ties to both those nations. However, Hitler has said that he will not invade other nations, and everybody knew that an invasion of Poland could trigger a war with Britain, France, and the Soviet Union if Germany decided to do this. So, Hitler and Stalin are actually going to get together, and they're going to hammer out a peace agreement that says they would not attack each other in regards to Poland. Like, they will never attack each other over the land in Poland. They signed this non-aggression pact, which is what it was called, and separately they go into another room and they sign a second agreement that says they will both invade Poland. They will not fight each other in Poland, but they will take and divide whatever property they see fit within Poland. Okay, the Germans begin their invasion of Poland on September 1st, 1939. Whenever the German Luftwaffe, or the Air Force, is going to invade or start bombing areas over Poland in order to take over, the army is going to invade as well that day. This is the first example that the world will see of blitzkrieg, or lightning war. In other words, this is war that moves very quickly, it comes as a surprise, and basically it moves very swiftly to take this territory. Britain gives Germany 24 hours to get out of Poland, otherwise Britain will declare war on Germany. The power to declare war comes not from the British Parliament, but it comes from the monarch of Britain, which at this point in time was a man named King George. But anyway, he actually had a speech impediment, and delivered the radio address to declare war on the evening of September 3rd, 1939, and spoke very clearly for the first time in public. Had his speech coach there with him. If you've ever seen the movie The King's Speech, highly recommend it. It'll be on my list of things for you to watch this week if you want to. But delivers a speech, and many people, I think, were confused by the fact that their king they knew was not a good public speaker, had delivered this elaborate speech explaining why Britain had to declare war on Germany. But anyway, once that speech is delivered, Britain has officially declared war. France joins in soon thereafter. Okay, Hitler, as I mentioned before, there's this question of, is he going to stop? Okay, and it's the same question we have as of right now with Putin. Is he going to stop just with the Ukraine, or is this going to expand further? But Hitler is going to continue into Norway and Denmark, and he says he needs these two areas to promote freedom and independence for his new empire, and felt that those two places posed a threat to him, and also that the people there wanted freedom and independence from their oppressive governments. Once Hitler has these two places conquered, France is going to become the next focus. France is subjected to blitzkrieg as well. Germany invaded rapidly and essentially forced the British and French militaries back onto the beach at Dunkirk. Another place, or another thing that they made a movie on several years ago. I actually show this in my World Studies class at the end of the year as our end of the year movie. But at Dunkirk, it is seen as a miracle because World War II could have headed south very quickly had this evacuation not occurred. But the the British and French military gets trapped at Dunkirk on the English Channel. There are 400,000 men that were trapped there. Okay, they cannot get large military ships onto the beaches there because they are constantly torpedoed or bombed, or there are air raids over the place. But you have almost 500,000 people on this beach that need to get out of there, otherwise they're going to be swiftly massacred by the German military as they come in because they are surrounded on all sides. The British wound up going to private boat owners, people that had boats that they just used for weekend enjoyment, kind of like yachts and stuff like that. And thousands of boats showed up across the English Channel. They evacuated 330,000 people by private boat, and this is in the summer of 1940. Once those soldiers were evacuated, the British began reorganizing and preparing for an invasion that they thought was coming from Germany onto the mainland of Britain. That never did happen, but I'll talk about why later on. The French are forced to have, or the city of Paris is overthrown, and the French are forced to have a government in exile throughout the rest of the war until France is liberated in, I believe, July or August 1944 after D-Day. Okay, so shortly after this, Italy is going to join the war. They are going to invade France from the south, helping to force that surrender of Paris. And Charles de Gaulle, if you ever fly into Paris, that is the airport there is named after him. Very influential politician in French history. He is going to set up a government in England to basically run the French resistance throughout the rest of World War II from Britain, and then takes over power of France whenever he comes back following the war. Okay, now Hitler's focus on Britain. I mentioned before, after this evacuation at Dunkirk, the fighting is going to begin in Britain in the summer of 1940. The Luftwaffe is going to attempt phase one of Blitzkrieg. They do call this bombing raid the Blitz. There are thousands of bombs dropped on Britain throughout the course of that summer, and it destroyed several cities. It killed tens of thousands of civilians, and you still have some very older British citizens that talked about, they aren't bothered by very many things because they survived the Blitz. Matter of fact, if you've ever seen the original Jurassic Park, the old man who played the owner of the company in that movie, he was himself a British citizen that survived the Blitz, and there was a hurricane that hit during filming, and he was the only one that ever got a good night's sleep, and he's like, guys, I survived the Blitz. I can sleep through anything. But this Blitz that took place in the summer of 1940, like I said, planes flying over constantly at night, bombing various targets. The bombing lasted about 2 months. But the amount of stuff that is destroyed in Britain by these incendiary, which are bombs that explode and burn, the amount of stuff that was destroyed during this still has an impact on British society because the amount of old buildings that were destroyed, they wind up having to build new ones, and the architecture in some cities just doesn't quite match up. But anyway, the British, talking about relevance to your life. They had a new gadget that the Americans had been experimenting with, and this is called radar. And on the radar, they could see blips of where planes were coming in, and they could plot what time of night they were coming in, and they figured out that the planes were coming at the exact same time through the exact same path every night, thanks to radar. Well, the invasion of Britain is actually prevented because the British line up their anti-aircraft guns and point them in the direction that the radar had said these planes were coming in from, and they began firing one night. And specifically on September 15th, 1940, they began firing at these planes, shooting down 185 of them. This is going to officially end the possibility of Britain being invaded, which who knows how the war would have come out if the British had been invaded. But Hitler's original plan was to go ahead and invade Britain, but that did not happen as a result of the British using new technology, figuring out Hitler's bombing runs and preventing further destruction of Britain. Okay, so that is going to conclude the European side of things in a nutshell. I just went through about 3 weeks of world history there, or 3 course weeks, I should say, of world history right there. So hopefully you have a better understanding of why this war took off and how it expanded. Again, there are some things relevant in terms of what is going on with your life right now over in Europe, which it may not directly impact you right now other than at the gas pump. But hopefully you'll be able to see, World War II, while there are a lot of stuff or a lot of things in here that are kind of trivial, there is some relevance in here about what's going on in the current events. Okay, next I will talk more about how the United States winds up getting involved.